Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Lawyers and Mediators International Show and Podcast by InstantMediations.com, where we discuss law and conflict resolution topics to educate both professionals and everyday people. Hi, I'm Mac Pierre, attorney, mediator, and arbitrator working throughout Florida and Texas.
And I am Natalia Olowska Pierre, advocate, mediator, and arbitrator from Warsaw, Poland.
I'm Thomas Giglione. I'm an arbitrator and mediator, and I'm talking to you from Hanoi, Vietnam. I'd like to introduce my colleague and good friend, Brett Lovette. He's involved. He's a mediator, negotiator, and specializes in negotiations training. Brett?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you, distinguished colleagues. I have a specialized, or I've specialized in the areas of sexual harassment prevention, bullying prevention in the workplace. I also have ventured into other areas that surround mediation, such as family reconciliation, dealing with family estrangement, and yeah, I'm happy to be here.
Thank you so much, especially if you are the perfect fit for today's topic, which is returning to the workplace after COVID, bullying and harassment in the age of METOO. And what I would like to start with is that with the fact that the lockdowns are over and the rate of people who are vaccinated is growing, we are returning to physical workplaces everywhere in the world. And what comes with that is a stress of many individuals who faced already bullying and harassment, and now they fear that again, that it might happen to them. So on top of all the, let us say, ordinary stress that was connected with lockdown, with the threat of losing jobs, with this pain of being ill or losing someone dear, on top we are returning with all our stress and those other stressors that might await us there because our colleagues have been under such a stress themselves. So what can organizations do to manage workplace conflicts such as bullying and sexual harassment?
Well, I'd like to answer that question. First of all, thank you for the question. I think it's a good time to review. They always say prevention is better than the cure, and it's a good time to revise your company code of conduct and anti-harassment policies going into the workplace. And it's a good time to review those policies and perhaps include. I'm involved with dispute resolution system design in organizations, and it would also be a good time to execute anti-harassment and conflict coaching training for staff, and integrate that with the anxiety that might come with going back to work. Also, consideration for implementing an online system to report and monitor harassment. And so those are various ways that organization can prepare for going back to work. I think we have to stay focused on the bigger story, to whatever the next new normal is. I think we all have to ask ourselves, whether it's management or individually, a year from now, ask yourself this question. If someone asks how living through COVID-19 changed me for the better, how would I answer that? How would you answer that as a manager? How would you answer that as an employee? How would you answer that as an organization? Because it's a transition, and it's tied up with a lot of anxiety and a lot of unknowns, and we don't. That's what creates sometimes anxiety for all of us, is we don't know what we're going to be faced with in the future with this transition. So overall, as a company, I would look at dispute resolution design going back to the work. I guess you call it WFH as a acronym. I could think of other acronyms going back, but that, you know, that is the focus that I think that organizations should look at, is the review of such policies. And it's kind of like a renaissance, I think, in many respects, about going back to work. So yeah.
Yeah, Brett, could you contribute to that? Some information about what organizations can do to manage workplace conflict?
Yeah, that's a great question. It would have been a great question before COVID-19.
Yeah.
Now look at it. Now. Here are the things, and these are my, this is my opinion. So let me qualify it before I even begin to say any of these things. This is from my experience, in my opinion. Sensitivity comes to mind. So how do organizations, companies, businesses, leaders, how do they respond? They need to be sensitive. That's the number one word. So if somebody's listening or they're taking notes, I would encourage them to self-check or self-assess their sensitivity as an individual, if you're a leader, and as an organization, if you have the pulse of whatever that company or organization is you're a part of. Sensitivity to what? Sensitivity to what Tom already mentioned, which is uncertainty. And we all know how the brain reacts to uncertainty. It doesn't like it, right? It's scared of uncertainty. So leaders and companies and organizations need to be sensitive to themselves, and they need to look at themselves first, and then they need to look out to their people. And they need to do that with sensitivity. They need to be aware that people are dealing with uncertainty, and generally they don't deal very well with uncertainty. So they need to respond with that wisdom or with that understanding in mind. Another word that comes to mind is boundaries. And I think that even though we used the term boundaries before COVID-19, I think COVID-19 could have been a real game changer in helping us as individuals to understand boundaries even better. When you talk about remote work and people going back to going back to the workplace, well, what did they have to do in the home? If they were in the home, they probably had to set boundaries. When dad or mom is in here and doing this, then the children are outside, and so we all, hey, the bathroom is off limits when dad or mom or whoever is in there doing. So we got into the remote world forced us to deal with boundaries, even in a minimal way. Now we have to take that back into the workplace, and I say we continue to build on boundaries, and maybe we can use those boundaries that we better understood working in a remote setting and make application to that in the workplace. And we can go into that in more detail later.
Yeah. Thomas, did you have any follow-up on that?
Yeah, I think, after working from home, like for a long period of time, we're communicating via email or by Zoom. I think we're missing a real, going back to work. We don't want to go into our little cubby hole into emailing and you might be doing a Zoom within your own department. And I would shy away from doing that, because rapport is very crucial for any kind of communication, especially negotiations. If you don't have the good thing about going back to work, you'll have physical rapport. You'll see body language and all the rest of it. And there will be, I think, a tendency, human nature was, we've been, emailing each other and, going on to Zoom, and we want to get out of that and get back into face-to-face communication, even if it involves, a manager who might be bullying you, or there might be some situations that are uncomfortable. But face-to-face rapport is the key. before I would email somebody, even within my own department, if I was working there, I would chat with them and develop a relationship. Even online, I notice a lot of people, what they do is they do introductions and then they get into negotiations. And I find there's a missing piece, that is rapport, that will help and make the negotiations fluid. For example, I had a call this morning with somebody I never met before, negotiating I was negotiating with them, and before I started negotiating, I started doing the small talk. He was in Jakarta, I'm in Hanoi, and his name was Samuel. I said, well, that's my son's name, and I said, I'm working from home, and and he goes, really? Oh, really? Your son's name's Samuel? It's like he was incredulous because, that's not a very common name. And my son was making a little bit of noise. He was playing with Lego. And I said, well, here, here's my son, Sammy, Sammy saying hi. He's got the same name. And, I'm a father. He's a father. He's got a grandson who's the same age. So we talked like 5 minutes before we ever started negotiating with that. Now, I'm in Hanoi. He's in Jakarta. And sometimes in the workplace, workers might as well be in Hanoi and Jakarta the way they're negotiating, and that's just going to create the conflict and exacerbate any tensions that are going back to work. So anyways, basically, I believe chat first before you start emailing colleagues and everything. Develop that rapport, the small talk before you actually start negotiating or communicating with fellow colleagues going back to work. That's my suggestion.
Thank you, Tom. This is why we're all mediators, right? And I don't know if Brett had mentioned that about himself earlier on, but we're taking the mediation skills that we have and we're applying it to conflict resolution in the workplace. So this is why we're doing this. Brett, I wanted to follow up with you. You had said something recently in a prior discussion we had about how, despite the increasing number of laws that are being put on the books to fight the problem of sexual harassment in the workplace or bullying in the workplace, it still is a problem. It's still a pandemic in a way. Can you discuss a little bit about that? Why you think that problem persists? Before we move on to what tips you can give to minimize conflicts in the workplace after we're leaving the post-pandemic world.
Okay. Thank you for that question. I'll try to make it concise. I actually used this particular point to open up discussions when I was doing those discussions, especially in person or doing the compliance programs in person. And I would ask, does anybody in the room know how many legislative bodies of laws that we have in California in regarding harassment and bullying? Usually people don't know, and I'll say, well, do we have one or two or three, and generally I get them to the point where I say, well, there's 4 different legislative acts. 4. And I said, what does that tell you? And there's no right or wrong answer. I tell them, I just say, what does that tell you? And people give all sorts of different answers to what it is. And I said, here's my opinion. My opinion is that tells me that we really stink, actually, as people in the workplace. Because what happens when you introduce laws and those laws don't work? What do lawmakers generally do? They introduce more laws. And what do lawmakers do when those laws don't work? Well, they introduce more laws. And so we just keep introducing these bodies of laws. So, in looking at that, I said, well, that's obviously not the right track. Laws, introducing more laws. And I started thinking about it. And this is what I came up with, and it really is about mindset. So when you have a law, what are you doing? You're basically drawing a line and you're saying, do not cross that line. If you cross that line, you are breaking the law. The problem with that is that laws don't teach people to think. And I think that's the issue. The issue is people, when they see a law, they see a line that they can go all the way up to. And people will often, not because they're malicious or generally because they're nefarious and they're trying to do, but they generally will walk that line. And the littlest thing could, tip you over that line. I usually tell them, you could do something and not mean to do it, but because you're walking that line, now you're into an action. Now you have possibly a problem. So I said, wouldn't it be better if we came, or, again, going back to the mindset, wouldn't it be better, instead of focusing on the laws and how close we can get to something, why don't we start looking at things from a principled point of view and seeing how far away from the line we can stay? And that way, if that's the area that we're operating in, then even if we accidentally do something, we're not going to cross that line, right? I mean, if you're walking on the edge of a cliff, and you think you're on sure footing, and somebody comes by and bumps you, you could go over the cliff. That's not your fault, but you're over the cliff. But if you're walking 10, 15, 20 feet away from the edge of that cliff and somebody comes by and bumps you, you have some space where you can fall or lose your footing. So I try to work with those kind of illustrations that harassment, bullying, and it's not just this, but I'm applying it to this because that's what I'm specifically there talking to them about. But I let them know that maybe we can start to think about things from, what's in the best interest of the other person, as opposed to how close to the line can I get? Actually, what's in the best interest of the person. So if I'm in the workplace and Tom is across from me, and I know that there are things that Tom feels uncomfortable about talking about or joking in a certain way. Now, I may think to myself, well, I'm not breaking any policy in the company. I'm not breaking any law. I'm just having some fun. If Tom can't handle that, well, that's really Tom's issue. He can, do something else or pay attention to something else. See, if I do that, that's hey, these are my rights and I'm demanding my rights, and I'm going to do all the way up to the line. Mm-hmm. Whereas if I'm coming from a principled approach, and I'm thinking about the best interests of other people other than myself, I'm going to realize, hey, I don't, maybe I can say that, and maybe I'm not breaking the policy or breaking the law, the company law. But aren't I breaking a moral law in a sense if I'm doing something that I know would bother somebody else or would make them feel uncomfortable? So I just try to start working in that realm with people and say, forget about the laws. Those obviously don't work. And I don't think people really even need to know the law. I think they do know the law. I think what we need to think about more about is principles and what is in the best interest of the other people that we work with and live with.
Thank you so much for that. And if we can follow, because you already have given us a specific tip, meaning change the perspective, see the things from another perspective, from the perspective of a person who possibly complains about something, see their arguments. And what are there any other tips that you can give so that people can actually really change this attitude that to them might seem completely all right, but to other people within the workspace, they can see and perceive it as something hostile to them, as something being a harassment or bullying. Mm-hmm. So the question to the two of you: what would you recommend? What would your tips be?
I guess I could start. I agree wholeheartedly with what Brett is saying. And I think if I give you an example, all of us as mediators, we set policy within our own mediation. When we do mediation, we say, okay, take your turn in talking, and please remember not to say anything derogatory. You set ground rules, right? And that's what I'm suggesting is, yes, there are legal boundaries, but companies set policy about behavior that's being conducted, and as mediators we set ground rules. So when those ground rules are broken, we don't say, hey, look, this manager broke did this to me, or I did this. Is you go back, hey, you agreed, you signed this, agreed to this policy and to abide to it. You broke your promise to, so basically policy is what is the best kind of parameter that should be used in defining these things. I think those things should be reviewed. Now, there are situations where, you know, the situation is, you know, very, very brutal. It's you know, to the point of legal ramifications. Well, to that person, that employee, I recommend logging everything, writing notes and taking notes, and because you might need it if you have to go to the legal route. So I would recommend doing that. But if things are that bad, I would spend some time looking at a BATNA, best alternative to a negotiated agreement, to a way out of that kind of, if you can't fix it, you have to look at alternatives to employment if things get that bad. And, you know, because you wouldn't want to go through litigation. I'll tell you, it's not the best alternative. So I would suggest, if you are in a really, really bad environment, take notes, log everything, you know, review policy, connect with fellow workers who feel the same as you do, who feel the same stresses and such in the workplace. So yeah, I think policy should be the key thing that should be reviewed in the workplace. And you know, the legal ramifications, I think I would stay away from, and but be prepared for the worst.
Thank you for that. Anything else that you can add, Brett, in terms of tips for people returning to workplaces?
Yeah, I'm gonna, everything I say, I feel like I'm kind of being redundant about. So forgive me if it seems that way. Maybe I can add an illustration that will, you know, further highlight the importance of self-assessing. We need to self-assess our thinking. So let me give an illustration of what I mean by, you know, we all have that. Nobody can force somebody else. You don't even know if somebody else is doing that. I'm just saying, I think we have a moral obligation to the world, to our families, to the people that we work with, to pay attention to our thinking. Why do I say that? Because in my opinion, we live in a world that is full of meism. You know, people look out for self first and then for other people. In general, not every single person on the planet, but in general, I see that. So how do we combat that? Because I think a lot of issues that you see in the workplace center around selfishness or meism, or putting what you want, what you desire, and what you think above somebody else. So here's an illustration I'll give in some of the trainings, or, you know, compliance programs I'll do. And I talk about red light, yellow light, green light. And I said sexual harassment is in bullying prevention, just to use that as an example. It isn't red light and green light. And what I mean by that is, most people know, and you can defer or you can disagree with me if you want. Most people know that you don't come into the workplace, you know, and I don't come into the workplace and there's Tom, and I walk right past Tom and I just grab Tom's rear end and I just squeeze it and I go, "Hey, Tom, good to see you today," you know, because I think that's funny, right? And then I walk on. You know, that would be quote unquote an egregious act. That would be something that would be considered, you know, harassment. That's a red light. I don't see people doing that. I mean, occasionally here or there, you may hear of something like that, but most of the time, that's not what people do. Green light is conduct that can be considered okay. So I said 95% of sexual harassment, especially the complaints, are yellow lights. And what I mean by that is that there are areas where people say, "I didn't realize what I was doing was wrong. I didn't realize what I said was offensive. I didn't realize, I didn't know." And unfortunately, if that elevates all the way up to the courts are going to look at you and say, "Well, it's not the intent that we consider, unfortunately, it's the impact." So you're not meaning to do something and not knowing to do something isn't going to cover anything. And we don't want it to get to that. So how do we do that? Well, I give the illustration. Let's say you're driving in a car and you're driving out in the middle of Iowa, right? You're just on a 2-lane highway and you come up to out in the middle of nowhere. There's no homes. All you see is hay, fields all around you. But for some reason, as you're coming up to there's a crossroad or an intersection, and there's a signal there. And it's got a red light, a yellow light, and a green light. And you're coming up to it and it's green, and then all of a sudden it turns yellow. What do you do? I mean, when it's red, do you have to think about what to do? When the light is green, do you generally think about what to do? Not usually, but when the light turns yellow, generally you have to think a little bit more about what you're going to do because there's factors involved. So if you're driving out in the middle of this area and the light turns from green to yellow, aren't you going to look around and say, well, if I don't see another car, there's not even another human being around here. I think it's safe. I'm going to go through that yellow light. The light's yellow, but I'm going to go through it. Well, you had the right to do that because it's yellow. So you go through it and you go through it safely. But let's take that same instance and let's go down to downtown Los Angeles where the courts are. Okay. And it's 12 o'clock noon and you're coming down, you're coming down Third and there's 50 people, 40 people on the corner because and they're going to cross the street and the light's green, but it turns yellow. Are you going to approach that intersection with the same thought pattern that you did the one that was out in the middle of Iowa? You're going the same speed and the light turned yellow at the same time, and you can probably go through it. But I think in that instance, you would be thinking, well, what if somebody steps out into the road ahead of time? What if a tire blows out and I veer off into the there's many more factors that come into play, even though the circumstances are the same. So I use that illustration to say it's about your thinking. It's about your mindset. If you're thinking in the best interest of other people, even though you have the right to go through that yellow light, you might actually apply the brakes because you're thinking, I can't control everything. And if I don't do what's in the best interest of those people standing on the corner, I could do something, whether I control it or not, that could affect them, could affect their life. And so you can approach the same situation, but it's the context and the dynamic of it that you're thinking. You have to apply your thinking. So long story long.
Yeah.
I
like to add to that. I agree with regards to this area of being self-aware and also the conversation about intention. I also work in threes. When you try to figure out what I divide it up into what happened, then you have a conversation with yourself about your feelings, and then identity conversation about yourself. So it's it's also in threes: red light, yellow light, green light. But what happened? Your feelings and also the conversation. So I would split those three. So what happened is focuses on separating your emotion from it and looking at, okay, this is what happened before you add your own perspective and viewpoints. So you have a clear objective view of the situation. And then I would separate the conversation with your feelings, because it might be, you can't understand the situation until you understand your own feelings. And then the third part is to identify what is your identity? How does this situation make you feel? Does it question your competence? Are you asking yourself, am I competent? Am I a good person? It challenges your worldview because you get an objective perspective of yourself. So again, I would divide it up. What happened? Your feeling, have a conversation with yourself about your feelings, so you separate it, and then think about how does this situation affect your identity.
Brett, any response?
No, I think Tom said much the same thing in his eloquent way there. So I just think we're all friends. We're all human beings. We all interact together, right? We need to, if we can think more about the other person than ourselves, if we can do some self-assessment and just think about, what am I doing here? I may have the right to do it, but because I have the right to do it, does that mean I should do it? That type of thinking is at the root of changing the dynamic.
Gotcha.
Not more laws.
Okay, and one of the things that was said the other day when we were getting to know one another was helping organizations establish a culture of respect, right? If people can, if that's the goal, if respect for your fellow man, respect for your fellow coworker and your colleague can be at the root of everything that we do, maybe we can, help avoid some of these conflicts that just keep coming up despite the laws that are being set against them. All right. So the last question, guys, is what can someone do to prepare themselves for difficult conversations and confrontations in the workplace? So now that we're going back to work, what particular advice could you give to the individual to prepare themselves, him or herself, for difficult conversations and confrontations? Any one of you.
Go ahead, Brett. I didn't want to monopolize it.
No. I prefer that you go first on this one.
Okay. All right. I know Brett is working on a radio program, and one of the themes that he has is compassion, and I like that theme. I think we have to go back to the humanity. We got to look at the big picture. I think like I said at the outset, you got to look at how has this situation, the COVID situation, may be better. We all are victims of this situation. How is it maybe better? Look at the big picture, going back to work. Look at rapport. Rapport is very important. Going back to the workplace, instead of, going back into our cubicles and going back to our work from home, I call it the WFH scenario, and we might be entrenched in those settings, and we need to go back, and some of us might forget how to talk to each other. But I like Brett's theme for his radio program, that we need a bit of compassion, and we need understanding, and we need to sit back and gain some self-awareness. Dividing, as Brett had mentioned earlier, what is the intention? Dividing our emotions and looking at things logically, and get camaraderie. If things are really bad, associate with people that feel the same, and see, bounce ideas and how they're confronting it. But I think compassion and rapport are the key, going back to work.
And Brett?
Yeah, I appreciate that, Tom saying it instead of me saying it about myself. But compassion definitely was one thing that I was going to bring up if he hadn't. I think the only other thing that I would add to compassion, which includes all the other factors that Tom talked about there, is boundaries. So, have compassion, be sensitive, as I mentioned before, to not just to yourself, but be sensitive to how others may be dealing or not dealing so well with things. And then your compassion will give you empathy, for them, and also for yourself. If you do that, then you are now you're hovering around respect. You're respecting. You're respecting it. And then I would also say boundaries. As you go back to the workplace, set some boundaries for yourself. Yeah, I give, here's another quick illustration. And I'm not trying to be crude here, but I say if somebody wakes up, nobody wakes up one morning and says, I'm going to go and, take a firearm and I'm going to go and assault people. They don't do that. Generally, what happens is over the course of somebody's lifetime, there's a number of boundaries that are passed that allow a person on a particular day in time to then engage in an act like that. So maybe they grew up in an abusive household. Maybe they saw their father being physical with their mother. Maybe they were exposed to violence in certain ways, and so things became okay. So a number of boundaries were passed. So what I would say is, let's self-assess and check those boundaries. Where are your boundaries? Because if you don't set a boundary, well, then you've already, whatever you've already crossed is you're on to the next one. And most people kind of walk around. I don't think they think about boundaries that much. So again, much of my thing is, hey, us, don't stop looking out at, and I understand the Me Too movement, and I'm not a proponent for it or against it. But when you talk about Me Too, you're talking about a platform for people to say, hey, look at what happened to me. And I understand that may have happened to you. What I'm saying is we need, if we're really going to fix this issue, we need to look at ourselves first before we start looking out and pointing fingers and saying, hey, look over here and look over here. We need to look here first. And if we can start there and then move out from there, I think that's a far better approach. So boundaries, sensitivity, principled thinking about what's in the best interest of other people are the root of changing this dynamic.
I agree, Brett. And I think part of boundaries are also policies, because a lot of times, they're moving the goalposts on the policies. And I think this is a good opportunity going back for companies to review not only self-awareness for individually, but companies to review their policies in light of the changes that have happened to all of us. Thank you again for the opportunity today.
And thank you to both our speakers, Brett Lovette and Thomas Giglione. Thank you for your input into that. I do think that we need to continue on our topics of returning. Today we've discussed returning to the workplace after COVID and concentrated on bullying and harassment in the age of METOO and preventing it in the workplace. But there is so many other aspects of returning when it comes to the end of COVID. There will be returning to schools. There will be returning to family relationships. And we would want to cover that with you both. That will be our pleasure. But for now, that will be all today. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And please remember that you can catch this discussion and every single previous one or the next ones on our instantmediations.com website, on our Lawyers and Mediators YouTube channel or Instant Mediation app. Be sure to stay connected.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much, guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you to all.
Thank you.